The Protagoras is one of the most humorous and interesting of the dialogues written in Plato's early period. It forms a sort of transition along with the Gorgias into the great dialogues of Plato's middle period. And in terms of its form, it's clearly a sort of comedy which leads to an acrasia, or not to an acrasia, but to an aporia, which is a sort of an impasse. We don't ultimately get the conclusion we were hoping to get at the end of the discussion. We reach a series of dead ends. And although the progress of the dialogue doesn't take us all the way to the unity of virtue and to a full knowledge of virtue, it does undermine some of the sophistic attempts to create a pluralized version of virtue, and also it gives us some very fine vignettes and insights into the sophists themselves. Protagoras is the main sophist, who is Socrates' main interlocutor in the course of this dialogue. But also with him, visiting at the same house of Callias, is Hippias and Protagoras, two other minor sophists. So we're going to get a look at the sophists in action, and in this case a group of sophists that are all together, engaging in, if not a common pursuit of knowledge, a simultaneous pursuit of appearing knowledge, or the appearance of knowledge. The Protagoras is remarkable for its juggling of several different themes simultaneously. The first big theme that clearly comes through is the connection between pleasure and virtue. Towards the end of the dialogue, there's a discussion of acrasia, which is the technical term for weakness of the will. And Socrates and Protagoras try and find out if there is such a thing as weakness of the will, and how that connects with hedonism as a doctrine. Hedonism is the idea that pleasure is the good. In addition to the connection between pleasure and virtue, there's also a kind of combat, a kind of dialectical interaction between rhetoric on the one hand, which is what the sophists do for a living, they make long speeches, and dialectic, which is Socrates' main way of investigating any question. So the Socratic kind of education based upon dialectic and the sophistic kind of education based upon rhetoric are compared and contrasted, and in the long run, or in the short run, because it's not a very long dialogue, the Socratic kind of dialectical education wins out. In addition to that, simultaneous with these two themes, there's a conflict or a sort of contrast between logos and mythos, between reasoned, rational discourse and figurative discourse, poetic discourse. We're going to find out towards the end that although Protagoras wants to make a distinction between the earlier poets like Homer and Simonides and Hesiod and himself, and his ilk, the modern sophists, it's going to turn out that there's a considerable similarity, there's a considerable overlap between the ancient poets and the mythos that they generate and the kind of speeches that the sophists generate. In other words, the sophists and the poets are closely connected both intellectually and morally. Finally, the last of the big themes that's offered to us in this dialogue is the conflict between unity and plurality. In other words, Socrates and Plato represent a sort of intellectual drive towards unity. They want one of everything. They want to take the multifarious many, all the various parts of some giant whole, and unify them, and in this unity find some sort of conceptual coherence. Now, opposed to this drive towards unity is Protagoras himself. Protagoras is not represented very favorably in this dialogue, and he seems to come off as rather vain, rather mercenary, a very murky kind of a thinker, the sort of a thinker that thrives in ambiguity, that thrives in the twilight, half dark, half light area, where no one really knows what they're going on. His eyes are attuned to seeing in the dark. And his favorite kind of discourse is a sort of relativistic discourse which does not demand extreme precision the way Socrates does. He likes long speeches as opposed to Socrates' kind of dialectical interchange where we examine sentence by sentence, word by word, line by line. This ambiguity that he gets from long speeches is what Protagoras thrives upon. He also likes poetic imagery. If he has a choice between presenting a logos, a reasoned discourse, and a myth that he invents on the spot or perhaps has a collection of them in his memory, he always goes with the mythos. He finds it more pleasurable and also more advantageous. It's very hard to get hold of an antagonist that's producing a myth. And Protagoras knows that he's not going to take too much criticism about a myth itself, because myths are notoriously protean. They tend to move around. They don't give us something clear and definite to fix our thinking on. In some ways, you could say that Protagoras is the advocate of myth, and poetry is his favorite discipline, and Socrates is the advocate of mathematics, because it gives you that pure, crystalline, definite thing to think about. And so in some ways, it's a fight between the advocate of pure reasoning and the advocate of imagination, the advocate of murkiness or ambiguity. Now, this murkiness or ambiguity makes itself immediately apparent if we think about what Protagoras is famous for, not just in this dialogue, but in Greek culture as a whole. He's the one that coined the term, or the phrase, man is the measure of all things. And what that means is that all things, all thinking, and all being are absolutely relative to the knowing subject. So you may think that 2 and 2 is 4, and someone else may think that it's 5, and well, for you it's 4, and for him it's 5, and whatever other answer we get from somebody else, that's true for them too. And what it does is, it's not limited, of course, to mathematics. It's also questions of taste. You may think a painting is beautiful. Someone else may think it's ugly. Well, both things are true. The problem is he takes this relativity, this absolute relativity, and extends it throughout the entire realm of discourse, even to things like mathematics or knowledge or logic. What this does, the result of this drive towards infinite plurality, is that language breaks down altogether. We end up talking to ourselves, because you may have one language and you may be meaning one set of things with the words you use, but I'm using words that may seem similar and may not, depends on who we ask, right? It'll change from person to person, and you really can't compare my language to yours. What this does is put into our thinking a sort of centrifugal force that atomizes all of us, and we all end up becoming solipsists. We all end up talking to ourselves, because there's no coherence between these absolutely relative nodes of judgment. What Socrates is trying to do is force Protagoras away from that extreme relativism, which in some respects is perhaps built right into the sophistic position itself, not just to Protagoras. What Socrates is trying to do is create a sort of conceptual drive towards unity, which makes real communication possible. And the only way that real communication will be possible is if we share, at least in part, perhaps in whole, but certainly in part, a common language, a common set of meanings for our words. So that means that man isn't the measure of all things, and 2 and 2 really is 4. And if you think it's 3, it's not that you're right and I'm right, you're wrong. The only way that it's possible for anybody to be true, to be right, or to make a true affirmative statement, is if it is possible for people to be mistaken. If there is just your opinion and my opinion and the next person's opinion, what we end up with is the impossibility of anybody making mistakes. And if you can't make any mistakes, there's also no need for any teachers, because there's nothing to teach anybody, because whatever they think right now is right, and if the teacher gets them to think something else, well, then that'll be right too. So there's no change, no gain. So Protagorean relativism actually ends discourse altogether. It atomizes us and tends to tear social and moral and political bonds apart, and also ultimately logical bonds. For Socrates, one will be overlaid on the other. So this is what Socrates has in mind when he comes to see the great Protagoras. He intends to go to him directly and say, what is it you teach? What is it you know? And how is it you'll improve my young friend by having him study with you? He's going to give you money. What does he get from you? This is going to be the upshot of his argument. Now, one other thing we should notice before we look at the details of the argument itself. When you are reading the dialogues, it would be a good idea to look back at the symposium when you look at this dialogue. The reason why is that almost all the speakers in the symposium are here. Right? It's held in the house of Callias, and there are 12 or 15 young men there, plus the 3 sophists, and all of the important speakers, Agathon and Pausanias, from the symposium will be here. Also, when you're reading this dialogue, you should look at the Gorgias, because many of the same themes that are presented in the Protagoras are covered from a different angle in the Gorgias itself. So those are the 2 dialogues you should connect with it. Let's think how it starts. First thing that happens in the dialogue is Socrates begins narrating his interchange with Gorgias and the other sophists to an anonymous friend in the marketplace, and he narrates the dialogue just after it's happened. Socrates has just left engaging in this encounter with Protagoras and the other sophists. And he says, this morning, first thing, Hippocrates came to my house before sunrise and woke me up and said, Socrates, get up. We have to go see Protagoras. He's in town, and he's a famous thinker, a famous sophist, a great intellectual. And for that reason, the promising young men of town want to go see him, want to go listen to his conversation. They'll pay him what it takes so that they can become wise and cultured. And Socrates is has a much better nature than I do. One of his students woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning before sunrise, and he said, okay. He wasn't upset or anything. He went out and said, look, we can't go to see Protagoras and these other gentlemen at this hour of the morning. The sun isn't even up. It's not a decent hour. Let us walk around Athens until the sun comes up, and we'll have a conversation, we'll have a philosophical discussion, and the result of this will be that we can show up at a decent hour, and that's much more appropriate for us. Now, this is very important. Now, usually when we read one of the dialogues, we flip through these frame scenes, these first 2 or 3 pages of the dialogues, but in this case, it's very important. There's a lot of symbolic stuff going on. First off, I have been telling you all through my lectures on the dialogues that Socrates is the new Odysseus, and that there's a journey motif that goes through all of the dialogues. When Socrates walks around after taking the hemlock, when Socrates says, down I went to Piraeus. Well, here's the beginning of the Protagoras, and what are we going to do before we go there? We're going to walk around the city. We're on the journey again, and this is the journey of dialectic. It is also an image, an icon of real teaching. Socrates and this young man Hippocrates are engaging the dialectic back and forth, asking themselves the question, what do you learn from a sophist? What is it the sophists know that other people don't, that makes them worthy of their hire? Suggests to us that, first of all, real teaching is done through the dialectic. Real teaching is free. Socrates doesn't charge to educate this young man. That's the contrast that we're going to come up with. In other words, we're going to get an image of Socratic teaching first. Now, immediately after that, we're going to go and talk to Protagoras. We're going to see the other alternative kind of teaching. So, they walk around the city until the sun comes up. And of course, you know what the sun means. We did the Republic yesterday, right? All of these images, all of these symbols move through the dialogue. The sun is the good. And as we have the sun going up, we're moving from darkness to light. Figure it out. Right? So there's a tremendous amount of symbolic stuff going on in that first scene. And by the time it's a decent hour, it's 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, Hippocrates and Socrates go to Callias' house, and they're stopped by a eunuch doorkeeper. This is one of the great funny scenes in Socratic philosophy or in Platonic philosophy. The eunuch doesn't like sophists. And we got a house full of sophists here, and they're all talking and talking and talking, and they don't listen to each other, and they make long speeches, and they're a pain in the neck. The servants of the house don't like it, and in particular, sophists are viewed as being disreputable, corrupt and corrupting men. So when Socrates and Hippocrates come to the door, the eunuch has one look at them. He's really surly and unpleasant and slams the door in their face. Said, no, sophists, we don't want any. We don't have any room for you. We have plenty of sophists here. Closes the door on them. The idea here is this, because Socrates says explicitly to this eunuch, we are not sophists. We have come to see Protagoras. Do let us in. He does get let in. Key thing here is this, though. The demos of Athens, the people that killed Socrates in the Apology and in the trial and death of Socrates, they think that Socrates is a sophist. They can't tell the difference between Socrates' improving kind of discourse and the corrupting discourse of the sophists. Well, the eunuch, like the people of Athens, because they can't tell the difference between Socrates and a sophist, are missing something important. Right? Either testicles or philosophy. But the idea is that the demos of Athens are philosophical eunuchs. Right? They can't see the real eros for knowledge that is characteristic of Socrates. They don't appreciate it. So this scene is very carefully crafted. It's only a page, but it shows Plato at his best. I mean, it's caustic if you read it properly, and if not, you just turn the page. But anytime that you attempted to turn the page in a Platonic dialogue, you're not picking up what they're driving at. Go back and have another look at it. So we get by the eunuch that guards the gates of hell, and now we go directly again to an analogy, or to a scene, to an idea stolen directly from the Odyssey, Book 11. Those of you who know Homer know that Odysseus goes down to Hades, right, and sees the spirits of the departed and the heroic and kind of monstrous figures that are down there. Well, as soon as the door opens and Socrates and Hippocrates are admitted in, we have a replication of the kind of rhetoric that's used in that part of the Odyssey, Book 11. Socrates is the new Odysseus, and he's going down to hell. He's going down to Hades to see the monstrous shades that live down there. And Hades is full of sophists. Right? Think of the irony. I mean, it's in some ways like the Divine Comedy, right? I mean, we're going down to hell to see these great evil men, but they're still alive, but in a sense they never really were alive because their souls are dead. So we go down and visit the dead souls. I'm right about this journey motif, and this is the new Odyssey. Down we go to Hades, and we're going to find out at the end of it, when Socrates wins the argument and moves on, that Socratic rhetoric, the dialectic, the real way towards truth, is what leads us out of Hades. It's what lets us out of hell. The true pursuit of knowledge makes us blessed and divine. All right, so he goes into and out of hell. So here we're going to have a little comedy in hell. And hell is full of sophists. All right, once you pick up on that, you begin to realize that there's going to be a lot of witty interchange here, and all these people are slightly daemonic. We're going to have three sophists, and it's going to be like a three-ring circus. We're going to have one great one who will contradict himself all the time and say mushy, murky, ambiguous things. Why? Because this is the best he can do. He thinks this is clarity, or better still, there's no clarity to have, so mushiness and ambiguity is the best we're ever going to get. In addition, he's going to have two other sophists, Prodicus and Hippias there. And Prodicus and Hippias will be constantly parodying themselves. In other words, Plato is a great wit, and this is a true exercise in high comedy. Prodicus is well known for his ability to make fine distinctions between equal and equivalent, between happiness and joy, between certainty and sureness. In other words, he's great. He would have made a great lawyer in the sense that he can make non-distinctions between words. That's what Prodicus does all the time. The few times that Prodicus is going to talk in this dialogue, he's going to say, do you mean equal or equivalent? We should listen to both impartially, but not identically. In other words, that's what he's going to be doing, parodying himself all the time. Hippias, the other alternative, the other sophist, he's going to make the kind of standard distinction between nomos and phusis, but after listening to Socrates speak, or actually, after Socrates finishes speaking, Hippias will say, you know, that was a wonderful discussion, Socrates. I have something to say about that poem as well. The point there will be that Socrates' speech was absurd, and Hippias wasn't listening to it. He was preparing his own speech. That's one of the great drawbacks of this rhetorical matching of long speeches. When your opponent is talking for an hour or so, you're not listening to him. There's no communication going on. What you're really doing is thinking about what you're going to say. Well, Socrates has just gone through an elaborate lampoon of the kind of rhetoric that the sophists produce. And he makes all these ridiculous, absurd propositions. And at the end of it, Hippias says, you know, that was a highly meritorious discourse. I have a few things to say on that. And then Alcibiades comes and just cuts him off, said, later, you know, some other time we'll listen to you. Please continue the discussion. The idea here is that the sophists parody themselves. We have the great communicators of Greece who are unable to communicate with each other and constantly contradicting themselves. This is what hell is like in the Socratic sense. I mean, they're not afraid of torture and terrible damnation. They're afraid of people that don't listen to each other. That's what hell is going to be like for Socrates. All right? So the great journey into hell, and he comes away unscathed because he is pure of heart. All right. So the initial scene, they get in the door, they come in, and Socrates and Hippocrates are admitted in, and they come up to the great Protagoras, and everyone makes way for him because he's a gray eminence. He's an old man. He's venerable. People think of him as being a very intelligent fellow, one of the great thinkers of Greece. And Socrates comes up to him and says, look, my friend, the young man, Hippocrates here, would like to study with you, but I've got some questions. Or actually, I have some questions I've been wondering about. We were talking about this before. First off, what do you do? I mean, in other words, they talk to you, and what do they get from you? What art do you teach? And in addition, what is the utility of this art? In other words, what's it for? Why should they know whatever it is that you can teach? How can you improve them? And Protagoras says, very ironically, I like the way you put questions, Socrates. I like answering a good questioner. And see the end of the dialogue when the good questioner takes him out. It says he's not going to like that at all. He's going to get very balky and petulant the way all the sophists do when they're under the gun dialectically. So in response to Socrates' very direct and blunt questions, Protagoras gives a speech in praise of himself. It's called an encomium. And he says, I'm a very wise man, and I'm like other wise men in the sense that I'm very virtuous. And prior to the modern age, when a man could honestly call himself a sophist, we had other teachers who were wise men who were able to educate youth, but they called themselves poets. In the ancient days, people like Homer and Hesiod and Simonides hid behind poetry as a sort of stalking horse for the fact that they were sophists. In the olden days, before people became sophisticated and cosmopolitan, they thought sophistry was a bad thing, but not now. Now I don't have to pretend to be a poet. Now I can admit directly that I'm a sophist and an educator. Now this will be ironic because in the next speech he's going to create an elaborate myth. The point will be that in fact the poets and the sophists are really the same sort of people. People that thrive on verbal and intellectual ambiguity to fool ignorant people into doing their bidding. So he analogizes himself first of all to Homer, the great teacher of Greece, and Hesiod and Simonides. So he has an enormously exalted opinion of himself. And when he's asked how he can improve Hippocrates, he says, each day that Hippocrates comes and studies with me and listens to my conversation, he will become a little bit better. And day after day, each day he'll be just a little bit better than the day before. Thank you. Now, that's a totally ambiguous, useless explanation. In other words, better in what way? In what respect will he be benefited? You can't say that he gets a little bit better every day and have that be a meaningful answer. Well, that's the best Protagoras can do. Remember that ambiguity is what he thrives on. That's his strong point. So Socrates bores in. He refines the question and says, look, precisely and specifically, what is it that you teach, to whom, and what is the benefit? And so after a little back and forward and a little hemming and hawing, Protagoras says, I teach politics and good citizenship. He teaches political virtue. Socrates says, political virtue? That's great. I mean, you said the magic word, virtue. Now, I mean, Socrates has got you, but it'll take a while for the argument to develop. He says, political virtue, well, here's my problem. Ironically, Socrates says, I've been worried about that political virtue. I suspect that it's impossible to teach. Here's the reason why I suspect that political virtue may be impossible to teach. Number one, it doesn't seem to be any kind of techne, any kind of an art, any kind of a logos or craft. Here's the reason why. Here in Athens, we have a democratic city. And when the government wants to build a ship, they go to the shipwrights and ask them, can we build this ship and how much will it cost? They get some technical specialist. When they want to build a wall or a temple, they go to the masons and they go to the architects and say, can we build this thing and how much will it cost? And the reason why they go to the specialist is because it's a specialized kind of knowledge. It's a techne or an art. But he says, when we want to decide what laws are wholesome, what laws are just, what laws are a good idea, we ask the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, we ask everybody. So that must mean that there must be no techne to constructing good laws. There must be no kind of knowledge analogous to shipbuilding or masonry which allow us to create a just society or good legislation. So that's my first reason, he says, for suspecting that it's just impossible to teach political virtue because nobody knows what it is. We can't find a specialist in it. That's number one. Number two, he says, if you notice the sons of great politicians, well, great politicians must have this political knowledge, this political excellence that you talk about, but their sons are usually useless. They don't teach them anything. The sons of Pericles weren't good for much. And since that's the case, well, the question arises, if the great politicians won't teach it to their sons, who will they teach it to? And if they're not willing to teach it to anybody, then perhaps they don't know it. Perhaps they do it by luck or art or divine dispensation. Well, that's the first big interchange between the two. Now notice first off, Protagoras, when first encountered by Socrates, gave a speech in praise of himself. That's the rhetorical, sophistic component. Socrates then engages him in the dialectic, back and forth until we find out, all right, where the argument is going. We have this dialectic. The whole dialogue is organized like that. There's a constant dialectic. First we get a speech, and then we get a series of dialectic interchanges. And then we get a speech, and then we get dialectic interchanges, and then we get a speech, and then we get dialectic interchanges. It happens 3 times. So the whole dialogue itself is one big dialectic. And in between the second and third sets of speeches and dialectic, we get an impasse, which is worked out between the two. In other words, it's a fight not just between Socrates and Protagoras, but it's an argument between these two styles of discourse and these two kinds of thinking. That's what it has in common with the Gorgias. 2 different ways of thinking and talking are being contrasted here. And as in the case of the other Platonic dialogues, the dialectic emerges victorious. Because at least then we know what we're talking about. We move from the realm of darkness to the realm of light. We can precisely analyze what's going on. And Socrates' commitment to communication and to the clear articulation of ideas emerges triumphant. What remains to be shown is that Protagoras himself is not committed to that. He's just committed to making a few dollars. Socrates never contradicts himself in the dialogues, or very rarely, unless he's doing so intentionally. Protagoras does it several times in the course of this dialogue. Like the Euthydemus, will find that the sophist believes one thing and also simultaneously believes another. He's not a unified, integrated soul. Right? He believes a number of different things. Now, faced with this challenge from Socrates that political virtue may not be teachable, Protagoras says, well, would you like me to give a logos or a mythos? In other words, how would you like me to respond to that? Do you want a clear dialectical argument? Because I can do that. I mean, I'm an experienced speaker. I can speak in every style. Or would you like a really nice story? And of course, since we have people out there other than Socrates, they decide, we'd like a really nice story. Whichever turns you on, whichever you really like, that would be fine. So tell us a story, granddad, because he's an old man, a gray eminence. And he says, you know what, that'd be fine, because I like telling stories. So they're all sitting in a circle, and Protagoras gives 2 myths. Now, remember, though, he just at the beginning of his discussion, praised himself because unlike Homer and Hesiod, he can admit that he's a sophist and not try and hide behind poetry. And what does he do the first time that he's called, to put up or shut up? He invents some clever story that he describes as pleasant. It'd be more pleasant for me to tell you a story than these difficult questions and answers. That's rather hard. You've got to do a lot of thinking to do that, whereas this comes real naturally to him. So he gives two myths. The first is the myth of Euthydemus, Prometheus and his brother, and that's where all the various virtues or capacities like claws and teeth and speed and quickness of running are given to the animals, and there's none left over for man. So Prometheus has to steal the fire of the gods, right? And that's where that's where human beings as natural entities come from. He then creates a second myth, saying, well, just with fire and the things that they get from Prometheus, human beings can't form cities and can't form justice. And so Hermes, a kind of separate creation, after human beings are running around with the animals holding on to the divine fire, then Hermes and Zeus decide to send down justice and plant it in every human heart. Isn't that an edifying story? Well, it's really not edifying. The point of it is this. The sophists thrive on the distinction between nomos and phusis. Phusis is the Greek word for nature. Things that exist naturally, like the law of gravity, are contrasted with things that exist conventionally, like laws against parking and no parking zones. Well, they think that all of law, including laws against murder or theft or rape, any of the great evils, they're also conventional, arbitrary, not to be taken especially seriously. Well, by creating two myths, one to cover phusis and one to cover nomos, Protagoras is really gesturing at that. And Socrates is much too quick to miss that. He knows exactly what Protagoras is doing. And Protagoras has an idea, but it's the usual hazy, murky, ambiguous, messy stuff that goes on in Protagoras' mind and in his rhetoric. So Socrates says, well, look, that's all very interesting, and that's a very nice kind of a speech, but there are problems with it. And Protagoras says, well, look, before we engage in that, because he'd like to avoid getting involved in the dialectic again, he says, look, this is why Athens is run the way it is, because the reason why democracy makes sense is because everyone has a little bit of this divine justice from Zeus and Hermes in them, and at the same time, there's a separate creation myth for our relationship to nature. The point here is that Protagoras is not an Athenian. All right? He's a foreigner, and he moves from city to city, all right? And he's a relativist with regard to language and to logic and to morals, because man is the measure of all things. As Plato showed in the Republic, politics is ethics writ large. Because he has a relativistic ethics, he also has a relativistic political theory. So he shows up at Athens and invents some handy-dandy speech and some great myth to explain why the Athenian method of government is a really good one. On the other hand, if he went to an oligarchic city or to a city run under a monarchy, he could invent some myth to explain why that's really good too. They're all good. If you Athenians like democracy, well, then I can give you some myths and it'll tell you what a great thing democracy is. If you have a revolution and an oligarchy takes over, I'll invent some new myths, or I'll tinker with the old myths and I'll explain to you why that's really good too. In other words, man is the measure of all things, and here we are in Athens, so democracy is really great. Now you, Socrates, are a malcontent, right? I can legitimize anything by inventing some cute story. You don't seem to be able to legitimize any government because you're not happy with any of them. So you're a problem, Socrates, whereas me, I've only been here a day, and I already think Athens is just great. And when I go to the next city with a different kind of government, I think that's great too, because man is the measure of all things. And you think this, and he thinks that. It's all a question of taste and opinion. And my myth can smooth over the apparent distinctions in logic, or not just apparent, the real distinctions in logic, and make anything seem plausible and legitimate. Well, Socrates goes after him and says, look, I need to know, I want to engage with the dialectic. I'm not especially interested in your myths here. And here's what I've been wondering about. Virtue. Okay, you've been wondering about this all your life, Socrates, but in this particular case, yes, Protagoras, are the virtues a unity or are they a plurality? Now it's a sucker question, because you know that Protagoras thinks everything is a plurality. So no matter what you ask him, he's going to say, well, there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it seems this way to him and it seems that way to him, and there's a little bit over there, and maybe it'll change, maybe it won't. In other words, he thrives on ambiguity, and he thrives on plurality, on diversity. You could say that he really celebrates diversity. As a matter of fact, he celebrates nothing else. There's no drive towards logical unity or coherence in him, whereas Socrates is exactly the opposite force. From many, one, e pluribus unum, right? You think that there are lots of virtues? Well, aren't they all really the same thing? Knowledge, something along those lines. So, at first, Protagoras gives mushy, murky answers. In other words, he won't give a direct yes or no. Is it a unity or is it a plurality? He doesn't like that yes and no kind of thing. Well, he says they have certain vague similarities, but also they have certain differences too. And he says, I mean, in a way he's balancing on the tightrope. You want me to give it, the different spin? You want me to make it the same? I mean, I can do either. and I don't have any definite fixed opinion about that in any case. So they begin to discuss, and Socrates begins to press, and he says, do you really want to stick by the idea that the virtues are a plurality, not a unity? He makes an argument about the function of virtue. Isn't it all, aren't they all the virtues, for example, courage or justice or wisdom, aren't they all opposed to folly? And if they're all opposed to one thing, folly, aren't they really all the opposite of folly, whatever that one thing is? That's going to turn out to be wisdom or knowledge later on. But if they all have a consistent opposition, then don't they all have one kind of unifying foundation? Now, Protagoras is backing off. He doesn't want to get tangled in with Socrates because he sees that he's a very dangerous man in dialectic. So Protagoras begins to bristle and begins to kind of become petulant the way all the sophists do when they get on the losing end of an argument, and then communication breaks down. He withdraws and he says, look, I want to give long speeches. So he starts to give a long speech, and of course the crowd praises him again, as they always do in these dialogues. And he says, well, some things are good for, for animals, some for plants, some for some people, some for others. For the sick, some things are good. For the healthy, other things are good. For the young, for the old, for the rich, for the poor, and complete plurality of virtue. And Socrates says, look, I want to engage in the dialectic with you. And as he puts it so ironically, I can't remember long speeches. Now, of course, Socrates forgets nothing, right? He has a completely focused memory. Everyone else may forget what's going on, and that's the point of these kind of long speeches. The sophists use words the way squids use ink, right? They throw them into the atmosphere, and then no one can see anything, and no one knows what we're talking about anymore. And that sounds like a great speech, so everyone claps at the end of it, even if they don't understand it. Socrates is the only one that doesn't clap because he understands it and says, that's not an answer to my question. And Protagoras says, well, look, I don't want to answer this kind of question, back and forth. It's really hard to do. So communication breaks down. The sophist on the one side is withdrawing from the dialectic. He wants to go towards rhetoric. Socrates ironically says, I can't remember things like that. Now remember when we did the Meno, all knowledge is but recollection. When you're reading the dialogues, whenever you see remembering or forgetting, underline it, because it always has some symbolic meaning. It always means either knowledge or ignorance. And when Socrates says, I'm ignorant, or I forget speeches, I don't have a good memory for them, what he's really saying is that this doesn't lead us to any kind of knowledge, and I'm ignorant of this kind of business. Well, this little interlude, this impasse, allows the sophists to kind of parody themselves. Protagoras starts making elaborate verbal distinctions which get us nowhere, do not advance the argument in any respect. Hippias says, gentlemen, and he gives a sort of set speech, Athens by nature is a great place, it's a center of learning. It's unseemly for you men to part without really resolving this discussion. And the other listeners try and create some sort of relativistic compromise. In other words, how about if Protagoras gives long speeches and Socrates asks short questions? Well, that doesn't make any sense. It's the stupidest thing you could imagine. These men who are trying to create some compromise don't understand that the dialectic has its own laws. These laws are not established by convention. Real reasoning, serious point-by-point thinking has its own logical principles internally. They are not established by having a vote on them. They would be that way whether you liked them or not. So Socrates is standing around while these guys decide if they can't come up with some useful construction of the dialectic. And he's thinking the dialectic is far bigger than you. It is prior to you. And you have to bend your knee to it. It doesn't have to adjust itself to your predilections. But they don't quite understand that. So they managed to bring Protagoras back in because, strangely enough, Alcibiades, one of the great evil men, or one of the great seducers of the Athenian people, is a friend of Socrates in this dialogue and shames Protagoras into coming back into the argument. He says, look, let him admit that he doesn't know how to engage in dialectic if that's what Protagoras wants to do, and pull out. Socrates admits that he can't match him in long speeches. So if they want to say, you're the king of this, I'm the king of that, that's fine. But Protagoras has too big a head to admit that. Once it's put in those terms that he can't meet Socrates on the level ground of dialectic, then his pride brings him back in. He's read too much Homer. Right? So back we go in. He's going to do something heroic and win a great victory here. So we go right back into the argument, but they give the serve, it's like tennis, they give the serve to Protagoras. They say, okay, old man, you can ask Socrates as many questions as you want, starting from the beginning. And then after you're finished asking questions, then you're expected to answer them. So, Protagoras, he doesn't want to talk about math, he doesn't want to talk about the unity of the virtues, he doesn't want to talk about any of that jazz. He says, I have an idea. Let's talk about virtue, but my way. Socrates, do you know the following passage from Simonides, the great poet, one of the guys he discussed in the beginning. And Protagoras gives him the part of the poem, and Socrates says, yeah, I know poetry. I'm not, I'm not an ignorant man. I'm very familiar with it. Well, Protagoras asks him some complicated question about what Simonides says about virtue. Now, the point is here that of all the kinds of knowledge, or of all the discourses that have any claim towards being knowledge at all, literary criticism is the mushiest. Right? Because you like this, I like that. There are 19 different ways of viewing the same poem or the same literary construct. And it's hard to say which is the best. There's the one you like and there's the one he likes. But how to hierarchically organize them, or how to unify all the various and sometimes contradictory interpretations of a piece of poetry, totally impossible. And that's what Protagoras likes. He says, let's talk about literary criticism. Let's talk about mushy stuff. He's going to drag Socrates into the intellectual quicksand and drown him. Right? Because that's where Protagoras has his great advantage. Socrates knows the deal, though. You don't put anything over on Socrates. He says, okay, you want to talk about Simonides? Well, Socrates gives an elaborate and highly ironic diatribe about this piece of poetry, and he gives 3 different interpretations, all of which are contradictory, all of which are incoherent, and all of which are brilliant. In other words, Socrates creates a sort of parody of literary criticism. And I mean, some of the interpretations are so wild and far-fetched that they're absolutely funny. In other words, I laughed out loud reading this, particularly those passages. For example, Spartans are often thought to be coarse, crude, uncultivated men. Nay, says Socrates. This poem suggests to us that the real reason why the Spartans have done so well in war is because they have deluded all the other Greeks into thinking that the Spartans get their prowess by constant military training and by constantly engaging in physical exercise. No. The Spartans have fooled everyone else into wearing short cloaks and engaging in boxing and wrestling to make themselves tough. That's not the way the Spartans became the masters of all of Greece. Nay. Whenever the Spartans want to consult their philosophers, because the Spartans are a very philosophical people, and of course everyone knows that the Spartans are the least philosophical, the crudest people in Greece. They're so philosophical and so subtle that they drive out all foreigners from their city, and then they consult with their wise men, engage in the dialectic, and that's how they manage to win all their battles and become the bravest and most virtuous men in all of Greece. Well, of course, no one believes that, and it's the broadest kind of parody of not only of the Spartans and of this kind of discussion, but of the whole practice of literary criticism altogether. He says, look, if you don't want to focus your thinking on any particular thing, and you just want to jump into the intellectual mush, what you get is incoherence upon incoherence, and it leads nowhere. This is a waste of time. I gave you 3 interpretations, all of which are contradictory, and all of which are really good. Now, there's no need for you to give us a 4th or a 5th. There's no point in this. This doesn't tell us anything about virtue. We don't learn anything about virtue by appeals to authority. We learn about virtue by using our heads. So after he gives this, Socrates says, well, now I've given you my interpretations, and I'd like to move away from this now, because this is a waste of time, actually. This reminds me of second-rate discussions among second-rate men going after the pride of Protagoras and all the others. He says, what I'd really like to see is more thinking and less talking. How about that? And the way we would do that is by engaging in the dialectic. Would you be willing to do that? And Protagoras doesn't say anything. Right? He doesn't want to get involved. He doesn't want to say yes. He doesn't want to say no. He wants to weasel out and can't figure out how to do it. As soon as, in all the dialogues, as soon as the sophist stops talking and doesn't want to talk anymore, it always shows that he knows the argument is busted. He's lost. But it'll be another few minutes before everybody else manages to catch up, because the sophist is smarter than most men. Well, Alcibiades comes through again. He says, do you approve of the way he's behaving? I mean, let him say that he doesn't want to engage in the argument. He wants to give it up, and he's going to go back on his former agreement, if that's what he wants to do. But if he doesn't, then answer the question. So Alcibiades again prods him along, and Protagoras says, okay, I'll answer questions. Come on, bring it on. And Socrates, of course, like a hound, back onto the scent. He says, good, I want to talk about the unity of the virtues. So he's forgotten nothing. This little interlude has been meaningless. We haven't found out anything about virtue. We're talking about Simonides. And he talks about a number of things. First of all, he says, now give me a straight answer. You can change, because you've been changing all the time. It's all relative and it's all messy. Give me your answer this time. Are the virtues a unity? And now Protagoras changes the answer he gave in the beginning. He says, well, I'd say they all have kind of a general resemblance, which is as close as you're going to get to Protagoras saying, yes, they're a unity, right? Kind of, sort of a general resemblance in a way, which is like saying, well, I think that 2 and 2 is sort of like 4 in a sense. In other words, you can't qualify this. It either is or is not a unity. Socrates wants to know some definite answer. And he says, with one exception, I think that it's probably true that courage is not part of the unity of the other virtues. I can see how wisdom or moderation would be part of one unified thing, virtue, but I've seen many evil, ignorant, foolish men who are courageous. And of course, that little bit, that little exposed area where courage is left out of the argument is just what Socrates is going to jump on, and that's where he's going to win the argument. So he goes around the long way. He says, okay, let's investigate that. First of all, he wants to find out about the connection between pleasure and the good. He asks Protagoras, do you think that the good and pleasure are the same thing? Protagoras says, no. I mean, the many do, the mob do, but I myself do not, which is the smart move, because he's tailoring his answers to Socrates. He knows that Socrates is going to want a very moralistic kind of reasoning, and he's not going to go for the idea that the pleasure and the good are the same thing. And then Socrates asks him about hedonism. He says, even though the many do believe that pleasure and the good are the same thing, you wise men, you and I, or Protagoras and I don't believe that, but the many do. At the same time, these hedonistic people, these people who think that pleasure and the good are the same thing, they also believe in akrasia, which is weakness of the will. And Socrates says, you know what they hold the view that sometimes a person is overmastered by the desire for an immediate pleasure, and the weakness of the will lets them do what they know is wrong. And then Socrates goes around and shows that hedonism, the idea that pleasure is the good, is logically incompatible with akrasia. What that means is that any time, that for people that hold that pleasure is the same thing as the good, weakness of the will is impossible. It just means that you want this good thing. It doesn't mean that you can be overpowered by the will. There's an internal inconsistency between akrasia and hedonism. So once he establishes that, then he goes back and looks at hedonism again. Now, within the first time that he gets Protagoras to agree that pleasure is not the good, the first time he gets him to agree that pleasure is not the good, Protagoras says, yes, I'll side with you. When he goes that pleasure is the good, he brings in the other two sophists. Why? Because once we find out that it's not a question of weakness of the will, that in fact becoming overmastered by pleasure is just a kind of ignorance, you don't know what true pleasure is, that means that there's something to teach, and that means that all the sophists now have a function. They can teach people what the true pleasures are. So all three sophists chime in towards the end, like Larry, Moe, and Curly, say, yeah, you know, we agree with you, Socrates, pleasure probably is the good, or it isn't the good. We don't really know which it is. We don't care which it is. We're incoherent, and we are not committed to any kind of logical order to our discussion. All we want is a good reason to have people give us money for whatever teaching we give. We don't know what our teaching exactly is, and it'll change if it is advantageous to it, but the point is that money is what it's all about for these people. And in addition, there's a kind of professional rivalry between the sophists that shouldn't be overlooked. So when they're all in the same room, they're all looking to develop their own eminence. And at the beginning of his discussion, Protagoras had shot a very telling look at Hippias, saying, I just teach one thing because I know how to speak, whereas Hippias teaches a great many things. He's a smart guy, in a certain way. Now, Hippias and Protagoras both see that Socrates is going to win the argument, because once we've shown that hedonism is incompatible with akrasia, with weakness of the will, then we have to go back to the original argument made by Protagoras about courage being separate from the other virtues. He says, look, if you were right in saying that many evil, ignorant men are courageous and brave, and if it's true that akrasia, or weakness of the will, is the same thing as ignorance, then it follows that self-control is knowledge. And if self-control is knowledge, the controlled man is the knowing man, and the controlled man is also the brave man. He goes out and meets danger. It's the fearful man, the cowardly man, that's the ignorant man. So that means that you were wrong in saying that ignorant, evil men are brave. Actually, it's knowing, wise men that are brave, and he flips them and just pins them. And here's where the other two sophists stand out of the way, because they want to see their great rival, Protagoras, taken down. So there's no honor among these guys, and they're not interested in the real truth of any matter of morals or logic. They're interested in making money, they are mercenary, they are incoherent, and they are not social animals. They have no unity amongst themselves or within themselves. This is the drive towards plurality. They're happy to see one of their own taken down a peg so that they can move up. Little do they know that Socrates could do as easy a job, well, I mean, there are dialogues called the Hippias, in which he would have no more problem taking them on and showing them to be incoherent than he had with Protagoras, the greatest of the bunch. So it turns out then that at the end of the dialogue, and it's a beautiful, witty, comic dialogue, that we've demonstrated to the satisfaction of Socrates anyway, the unity of the virtues. All of virtue is one thing. Wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, the whole great set of Platonic virtues, are one unified thing, knowledge. And ignorance, correspondingly, is vice. And at the end of it, Protagoras shows a little magnanimity. That's one of the nice things about Protagoras. He says, you know, I predict that you have a great future in philosophy, that you're a real smart guy, and you'll be one of the great teachers of Greece one of these days. Now, I'm a little tired. It's time for you to go home. You know, get out of here, in other words. Leave me alone. I've had enough of a beating for today. The point is now that Socrates has found the unity of the virtues and shown that dialectic is superior to rhetoric. This gives him a chance to not only organize the discussions in hell, but dialectic leads us out of Hades, out of the realm of dead souls, back out into the light again. And of course we know what the sunlight is from the Republic. So up we go and out we go through the use of dialectic over rhetoric. By finding something definite to fix our thinking upon, what we get as a result is true knowledge, and this true knowledge gives us moral wisdom, and moral wisdom is what dialectic is all about.